Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Traversing the Stars podcast. How are my loyal listeners? Thank you for your continued support. And as always, hit that subscribe button, everybody. We have an amazing show for you all because aboard the mothership is Tony Bedard. You know him as the writer of Green Lantern, The New Guardians, and Crossgen, The Negation War. He's now the writer of Call of Duty Vanguard and Star Riders from Fenom Comics. Now come join me as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Bedard. Thank you so much for coming to the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's always my pleasure to talk with you. You're one of my, like I said, you were my favorite writers, and it's so good to have you back on. So I always start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love of comic books, and who were your earliest influences?
Well, I think I always felt like I was a little late to comics. I think I used to read things like heavy metal every now and then, or but wasn't really keeping up with things. And then I was at a party and mentioned some comic that I'd read, and this guy disappears and comes back with his stack of Secret Wars. He's like, "Okay, you got to see this," and that got me into the Marvel universe. And then I started picking up other things. But a big early inspiration, because we're talking, this is the mid '80s, so that book was just coming out. And when I went to college, I was going to the comic store and I saw Nexus, which was one of the first comics. It was from First Comics, but it was one of the first indies that I ever picked up, and that one really got me. It's, to this day, I think it's the most influential series on me from anything that I read, and a lot of the sci-fi books that I wound up doing afterwards, like Negation at Crossgen, or Rebels, or even the Green Lantern stuff, was heavily influenced by my love for Nexus. So yeah.
Yeah, I really like that you mentioned Crossgen, because like I said, it was one of the great comic books for me when it came out in the 90s. I used to absolutely just devour everything Crossgen ever produced. It was such a great comic. Do you still feel like wistful every once in a while? You're just like, I wish I could do one more issue of Crossgen. I wish I could finish up Negation War.
Yeah. See, when I first got into comics, I went to school at Georgia Tech. I got a business degree. I didn't really want to use it. I didn't know what I wanted to do. The only thing, my dream was to write comics, but I felt like that was like, yeah, I want to be a movie star. Like that's never going to happen.
Right.
But then I met my wife, who was studying dance, and she got invited to study at a place called Alvin Ailey School in New York City. And we're living in Atlanta. And she's like, do you want to come up with me? We weren't married yet. And I thought, yeah, New York, that's where they make the comics. I'm going to go there. I'm going to fail miserably at trying to get in the business, and I'll finally have this out of my system. And when we moved up there, I got an internship at Valiant, the first time Valiant was around.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be, I never looked back. I got in there. They hired me. Like, I worked for free for a few months, as an intern, and then they hired me, and that was really the start of the whole career. But the thing about Valiant was that it really took off. I think we were almost at 20% of market share at one point. And then we really tanked just as quickly. We kind of, our reach exceeded our grasp. And so the funny thing was that later, when I was working as an editor at DC Comics, and Mark Waid called me up and said, hey, I'm doing stuff for this Crossgen place, and we need another writer. And I jumped at the chance, but it was almost like going through that whole situation at Valiant again, just in terms of how quickly they seemed to rise, and then, the bottom fell out. But what was important was that we were all working under the same roof there. I got to meet and learn from a lot of really great talent. And it was just like a hothouse of creativity there. And a lot of people that are still, top talent to this day, Jimmy Chung, Steve Epting, Greg Land, and not just pencilers, but like Laura Martin and Justin Pons are arguably the two greatest colorists in superhero comics. We were all there. We were looking at each other's stuff every day. Whoops, a little blurry there, and just learning. And there was a nice, I don't know, friendly competition going on to see, who could outdo who.
Yeah.
So for a while it lasted, that was the greatest place to work. And I still have a lot of good friends in comics from that time.
Yeah, 90s were such a golden age of indie comic books. I mean, you had Image for a little while. Image was again also in the 20%, 25. I think it was even beating like DC for a little while in the marketplace. You had Valiant, who was big. Crossgen had that quick surge. I mean, it really was a beautiful time to be a comic book fan because, like, for a little while, those indie comic books really did run the show.
Yeah, you know, and I guess still a lot of the best success stories are coming out of that scene, and especially because you can own your own stuff there, and so you know, I mean, The Walking Dead is probably the biggest example you can point to, but you know, and then there's funny stories like The Boys, you know, that thing has turned out to be wonderful. It started at DC, and I don't think the publisher liked that book very much because it seemed to be, you know, just kind of lampooning the characters that, you know, that DC really held dear. And so they wound up, you know, taking it over to Dynamite and getting back the rights. And I'm sure there's a few people kicking themselves at DC, you know, because that one worked out.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes indie creators, I've talked to indie creators, and they're like, you know, you're not writing comic books to make them TVs and movies, or writing them to be comic books. The TV and movies are financing indie comic books in a way that would have been unheard of 30 years ago. I mean, a lot of people who may not have been anything or made any money in the industry are raking it in because they sold their rights, and they're just killing it financially with these movies and TVs. I mean, it's like Walking Dead. Comic book did great, but the TV show is where where Kirkman's making the money.
Yeah. There's a weird, uneasy, symbiotic relationship there. You know, there's, you know, how many times did I go to Comic-Con and people were grousing about how it's not about comics anymore, you know, and yet the success of the Marvel movies has done so much for the, you know, the published comics. It all, you know, it all kind of goes back and forth, and just the general acceptance of comics nowadays. When I was 15, I was late to the game because nobody wanted to be caught dead reading comics back then. It was something that was your guilty pleasure, I guess. But you didn't tell anybody, you know. And now, you know, I walk around, everybody's got a Captain America shirt on, you know, that I would have killed to have that shirt when I was 15. So
yeah,
you know,
I agree. I mean, when I was a kid, I don't think I ever talked about comic books in school. I mean, I would have gone to high school in the 90s. I don't think I ever would have sat around and been like, hey, did you check out the new Green Lantern comic or anything like that? I mean, no one would have done it. Nowadays, you know, as a teacher, I go to, I'm in high school right now, I teach high school, and the kids are just chatting about, oh, did you see the new Doctor Strange movie? Did you see this? And like, I'm chatting about comic books in high school, and it's not even weird. It's just like what you do.
Yeah.
It's weird. I mean, it really is a great time to be a nerd.
This is true. Yep. That's one of the nice things over the last few years. And but yeah, trying to think of some of the other places that I had been, you know, because I got in at Valiant. That's also where I got in as an editor, but I also did some of my first writing there on Magnus Robot Fighter and a few other things. And then it all, you know, it fell apart. I worked for Billy Tucci, Crusade Comics for a couple of years, when she was like the biggest, you know, that was one of the biggest indies out there. And that was a real education, just because we were such a small outfit that I got to learn everything from, you know, just the inception of ideas and everything to dealing with the printers and outputting film, which was a thing you did back then before it all went digital, you know. And so that was really good. Then I went to DC. I think then it was Crossgen for as long as that lasted. But that Crossgen was really, I think, the turning point for me creatively, because I actually have a couple of these with me. This is Negation. Oh, it's backwards on here. I've got my thing mirrored. This book and also Route 666 are the two I think that I look back on with the most pride. And they got me subsequent work over at Marvel. I wrote Exiles for a while, and did a little Spider-Man mini, and then jumped over to DC, and you know, did most of my work in my career over there. But it's funny because you have to keep jumping around, you know, and that's the trick, you know. And sometimes you want to make the new publisher feel like they're stealing you from the other person, you know. I could tell that things were cooling off with me at Marvel, and so I tried to make that jump to DC quick enough that they felt like they were getting,
Yeah.
taking something from the other one,
Yeah, I mean, I with Crossgen, I remember how excited I was when I heard that Disney had purchased it and that it was going. I was like, all right, Disney is not going to waste Crossgen comic books. They bought it for a reason. They're gonna bring it back. They're gonna do something special with it. I know it. I trust Disney's gonna make it worth it. And then they came out with like 3 or 4 titles that had nothing to do with Crossgen, but had nothing to do with the characters. And then it's been gone. I mean, I don't think I even heard anything about it in what, a decade almost, maybe longer.
Yeah.
You think Disney will ever dig it back up and be like, yeah, we spent $1 million something on, let's bring it back?
You never know, but I'm not holding my breath. It would be nice if the right person over there who maybe had a moment as a reader, enjoying those properties, there might be somebody who kind of fishes them out of the drawer and does something with them. And I just reread Route 666 recently because Mark Alessi, the publisher at CrossGen, was trying to get a new thing going on, and he actually wanted to see if he could convince Disney to develop the properties. So I went back and reread that stuff, and it's funny because as a creator, you hate looking at your own stuff. It's just cringy. But if you haven't for a long time, it was almost like I was reading someone else's stuff. I was like, wow, this was actually good. Like,
oh, there's a surprise on your face with my God, this was decent.
Yeah. I mean, and part of me felt like I was much better than, what happened. But I again, as a creator, you beat yourself up a lot when you probably shouldn't.
I 100% agree. There's a comic book property I'm working on. I wrote the first issue already. The art is slowly getting worked on. It's called Terminus, and it's a sci-fi. It's like an operatic sci-fi story. I think the first issue was very good.
Cool.
And 6 or 8 months later, I decided to start working on the second issue. And unfortunately, at the moment, I'm just not feeling it. And I'm trying to figure out why. And it's weird. Like sometimes it feels like, every once in a while, like you have. Have you've seen The Boys, right?
Sure.
Like when they have that 24-hour vault superhero formula that they had that they shot up, right? It feels like that. Like sometimes, like for what I was like, I had it, and then it wore off, and I can't find it again. It's like punk writing is so weird sometimes. Like sometimes you feel like you've got it, sometimes you don't. It's hard to figure out why. Sometimes you did, and sometimes you don't.
Yeah. Deadlines kind of help in that situation when you don't have a choice. If it's something that you promised, you better deliver it. And,
right.
But if it's your own project, I have like 5 or 10 things in my computer that have sort of reached a certain point and then petered out, and I always promise myself I'll go back to.
So from a writer's advice, from a talented writer to one that's me, like how do you, like when you get stuck in that spot where you don't quite know if you've got it or not in a story, how do you find it again?
I don't know if you outline your stories before writing them, but a lot of times I found that if I kind of felt like I reached a dead end or something wasn't working, I kind of went to the structure of it, and usually it was a problem with how I had structured the story, and that, and I realized that if I took a left turn instead of a right one, a couple of events previous, that yields whatever I'm looking for. When I was at Valiant, one of the guys on staff told me that we needed to go and take a class from this guy, Robert McKee, that I had never heard of. Okay. And he wrote this book called Story, which previous to printing it, he just did as a seminar. And it was like, I don't know, $400 to go. And that's a lot of money. Yes. And in 1992, it was a lot of money. But it was life-changing. I learned a whole lot about just story structure and how you set things up. And, there are people that hate that book because they feel like it's a formula that kind of freezes you into something. But I always like having the recipe to go back to if I'm cooking something and it's not quite right. So for me, that was great. Structure was always the key.
How about a lot of writers talk about like hearing their characters' voices. And I think one of the issues I'm having is that I used to had the voices when I wrote the first issue, then I let so much time go by that I don't hear it again. So what do you do when you need to find the voices again?
I think that's different from project to project. And of course, if you're working on, like a DC thing where, it's an established character, that's
Yeah.
super helpful. But if you're, if you, yeah, I'm not sure. I think, you know, sometimes you look at how the characters relate to each other and what, what function, what space is that character filling up? What's their point of view on something? And you want to make sure that they all have a slightly different, place in the story. So sometimes that's helpful. Once you identify, oh, this is the naysayer, this is the optimist, this, that can help. And then, honestly, sometimes just write crap. You know what I mean? Like just get something down and you kind of have at least the framework there. Then you go back and then you begin to hear that voice. Cause if you're trying to figure out where it's going and get those details, that's tough, So I, almost anything that I wrote, I probably did about 4 or 5 passes on it before I felt like it was actually there.
So when you're going back and you're reading Route 666 again, this is obviously it's been almost 20 something years, I think, since it's been out. So what are you looking at when you read it again and reading, the younger Bedard's work on it? Like, what are you seeing and how you improved, how you progressed? Are there certain areas that you're like, well, I used to focus more on this than I used to? Well, what are you seeing now as years later?
I think maybe that over time you develop certain habits or go-to sort of techniques, but when you're first starting, it's all fresh, and you wind up taking chances and just doing things that are that seem to come out of nowhere. And so there was a lot of moments as I was rereading that stuff, and I was like, where did I get that from? Or that's really cool, but it's not something that I'm 55 now, so 20 no, I think I was 35 when I was there. So yeah, 35-year-old me was coming up with stuff that 55-year-old me would never think to do, and again, it's easy to kind of get down on yourself for something like that. So I have to remind myself that I've also developed a lot of insights and techniques that I didn't know back then. But mostly it was just that. It was like I was fresh enough that I was doing things that were surprising me, and that's always the best thing when you surprise yourself,
Right. It's kind of interesting that over the years there's been a trade-off. You, as 55-year-old you've learned, certain more techniques, you become wiser of storytelling and development. But on the other hand, younger you might have been more risk-taking and more willing to go, well, I don't know, especially because you didn't know any better. Fuck it, let's just throw it out and see what happens. It doesn't matter. I can find another job. This doesn't work. Let's just do it.
That's really it. I was definitely taking risks, and of course, being there with everybody else who was working there, you were always cross-pollinating ideas. And one of the beautiful things about working at Crossgen was that before we would start every issue, we'd all sit down for lunch together, and I would just verbally pitch them. Okay, in our next issue, here's what I think is going to take place. And as I'm going beat by beat through the story, I'm watching, Paul Pelletier, who was the penciler, Dave Mikas, the inker, James Rochelle, the colorist, and just seeing their reactions, and like if Paul was kind of like, I'd be thinking, okay, maybe we've got to rethink that part, and then also they would also just blurt out ideas. Oh my God, and what if such and such says this? And I'm there stealing every good idea I can, which sounds terrible, but really, I wanted all of my teammates to see their stuff in the final, product. If you're all creatively invested, it's so much better.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, especially because I think a lot, especially like, as I said, like a writer to another writer, a lot of us tend to like full control of our combos. Like we write the script and we dump it on the artist and be like, do this. And they sometimes do it, but you can tell they don't care. They're getting paid, so they're doing it, but they're not invested. And I like the fact that you were getting your team really invested, because I think a lot of writers forget that it's your project, it's your story, but it's your team. There's a difference there.
Yeah, this is a very collaborative medium, and if you're not getting your artist, if you're not getting them in a situation where they feel equal in it, then probably something's going wrong. I always wanted the artist to feel like they own something. And the great thing about comics too is that, when you're writing the script, you're seeing it in your head,
Yeah.
But God help me if what comes back is actually what I was envisioning. It was always a wonderful surprise to see how they took something and elevated it. And one of the great things in my development was working as an editor, because I worked with Grant Morrison and uh, 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 Garth Ennis, Brian Azzarello. I mean, some really top talent, and got to see, how they did things differently in their scripts, because nobody, there's no set format, right? But there were also things that were consistent between them. One of them was that they wrote very sparse panel descriptions. In general, in a script they were doing, it was 1 page of script for 1 page of art. And if you run beyond that in your script, you're probably overdoing it. Now, Alan Moore would laugh his ass off at that, because he's famously, writes these copious scripts, and he's the best that's ever done it.
Yeah.
But when you do that, when you keep it kind of spare, you're giving the artist a lot of freedom to make it their own too.
Yeah, I must admit, one of my favorite things that I own the Absolute Sandman editions, and at the back of those stories, he has one issue of script of one of the issues that he wrote.
Cool.
Neil Gaiman, for those who don't know who the Sandman is, for listening. And I must admit, I devour those things, but it's fascinating listening to what he wrote. I mean, sometimes it's detailed. Sometimes he would be like, whatever you want to do in this panel, just make it look good. I'm just like, wow, okay, that's so much freedom that I never. I mean, as a writer, I feel like part of me is like almost anal retentive about what I put in. It's like, gotta be this. And then you forget once again that the artist usually is visually better than you.
Yeah.
Let them do it.
When I was editing Hellblazer, and it was Azzarello and artist named Marcelo Fruzen were the team at the time, and there was one story that was coming up that had some content that we weren't sure, we wanted to show to Paul Levitz, who was the publisher. And so I met with him and Karen Berger, my boss, because I was working for Vertigo at the time. And the first thing, Paul brings up isn't the thing that we're worried about, which is that it's about neo-Nazis. And no, it was, he kind of brings up the script. He's like, what is this? This is lazy. Look, he's hardly writing anything in there at all, and I got where he was coming from. He felt like it was irresponsible for the writer to not give everything to the artist that he could, but those two were like jazz at this point. He didn't need to tell Marcelo everything, because they got each other. That's the ideal, I think, if you get into that kind of a collaboration.
So when you were with Crossgen, did you feel like you were in one of those? Have you ever felt that level of jazz in your teamwork?
Yeah. Working with Paul Pelletier on Negation, it got to that level. And also Carl Moline, who was the artist on Route 666. They're two very different people. I love them both very much. Paul is he's the hardest working artist I've ever run into. Like, if you did a stat panel, where it's just like, copy the background, on these three, he would draw the same background on the three, like he didn't want to take the easy way out of anything, but I loved him for it. And then Carl is a very spiritual person. He's the shiniest person I've ever met. Like, I still love talking to him. We talk every now and then. Just a really great guy, and he brought a whole different sensibility to it.
So do you think a lot of, especially DC and Marvel, not as much with Image and stuff, when they write titles, especially Marvel, the teams stay together for a very short span of time. They maybe do 6 issues, 12 issues, maybe they do a year or two, but they don't have that long-term relationship in a title. I think Marvel, not to knock Marvel too much, they seem to restart their titles every 2 years.
Yeah.
Do you think they're missing something by losing that kind of relationship between the team of just knowing each other, and the work probably gets better and better as this teamwork continues?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I think that you do miss getting that sort of thing, that long-term, fit. But of course, the sales, just the way that sales go, you're going to get a certain level at number one, and then it just drops off, and it's very hard to beat that curve. Very few books kind of find their footing and then actually go up after a while. So I think that's what they base those decisions on. And it's changed a lot since I got in the business. And certainly since Stan and Jack did 100 issues of Fantastic Four or something.
Yeah.
Those stories are so few and far between. But it's always a balance.
So you were saying that you had your business degree as a graduate from Georgia Tech, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some writers and artists and whatnot in the comic book industry would think business degree, that's nothing to do with comic books. But when you think about the industry itself, how much of an edge does it give you in understanding the business having that degree?
Well, I studied a lot of marketing and also got a certificate in organizational psychology, and every now and then those things were either useful to me, or at least it helped me to understand why a certain decision was being made, such as relaunching every 2 years or something. But honestly, after I got out of college and did not go into the business world, I was waiting tables for a couple years, and that I learned more from that than almost anything else.
Really?
Just about people, about sort of multitasking, because you got 4, 6, whatever, how many tables, and you got to keep everybody happy, but there's different things going on, and it's all very quick. And I learned a lot from that. And also at the time I was partying a lot. Like the shift would end, you'd have, a couple $100 in your pocket, and you're just, you've been going so hard that you're, jazzed. And so for a while there, I was going out clubbing 5 nights a week, probably. And which is not the most, I don't, there's a downside to that, but you learn a lot about people. And I don't know. I think I used a lot of that in stories, and so you basically, I guess what I'm saying is some life experience is definitely good.
So to the comic book writers out there, get out of the basement, meet some people, help you
write.
Yeah,
find out how relationships work, how they don't work, how people get along. Yeah,
that's awesome. So you have we'll go into your comic book in just a moment, but you transitioned to your focus of comic books to video game writing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the video games that you worked on, I'm probably gonna get the name. I'm gonna butcher the name. Shi no Numa.
Shi no Numa is the latest map from the Call of Duty title that I'm working on. Just if I can jump back a little bit. John Layman, who did Chew and several other things, he and I became friends at comic shows, and he had been working in gaming. And I remember one day we were talking, and he was grousing about his day at work, at the game thing. And I'm listening to everything he's telling me and thinking, this sounds like a great job. What? You meet these people, you come up with ideas, and somebody else builds this thing. And there was a sort of a connection there with how you work on comics and how you work on games. A lot of the comics writing skills apply very directly to game writing. Also, back when I was an editor, I remember one day a pretty prominent writer from when I got into reading comics showed up looking for some work at DC and left without any. And I was kind of shocked, like, oh my God. But that dude was, ruling the roost when I first started reading comics. And I realized that, yeah, this is kind of like popular music or something. You got some people that are always going to be, top acts, but most of them are, you have your moment in the sun, and then you better figure out what else you're doing. So I had a pretty good run in comics, but I was never going to be, Alan Moore or Neil Gaiman or, you name it. And I realized that at some point it was going to dry up. So I started looking for work in the games industry. And that's kind of how I made the transition. Wound up doing some stuff for a studio called Volition. They did a game called Saints Row. And then after that, I got this job at Treyarch Studio, who does the Black Ops games for Call of Duty. Yeah.
So when you're thinking about writing it for a video game, once again, someone who only does comic books and whatnot doesn't understand. When we think about video games, we just think they just kind of like appear out of they just like out of the ground, like a dwarf. They just kind of pop up. It's like a story, and everything just kind of happens.
Mm-hmm.
So for those of us who are apparently extremely ignorant in the world of video games, how do you approach writing a video game? I mean, is it, do you just write a plot? Are you writing alternate storylines for what characters can do? How are you doing this?
A lot of it depends on what kind of game you're working on. And And boy, for a while there, I looked down my nose at video games. I think it was actually one of the Treyarch games, Call of Duty World at War, that I played through the campaign and realized, oh my God, I'm really feeling this. This is, there's some good storytelling going on.
Yeah.
But of course, the format of the game has a lot to do with it. If you were doing a campaign in one of these, then it has more of that linear structure that you're used to. But a lot of the games are just, you're in there, 10 different things might happen and you don't know what order they're going to happen in.
Yeah.
And you have to find ways of making the individual moments feel good. And then somehow that cumulatively yields your story experience. So the zombie stuff is a great example of that. I had no idea how much story is in the zombies games before I came aboard at Treyarch, and there's a lot there.
So when you're thinking about writing for a video game, once again, the idea of a video game, or maybe from your perspective as a writer, is your main focus on telling a good story or on playability? Because obviously the players have to enjoy the moments, but as a writer, you know what I'm saying? Like, does the moments also of play get in the way of the story beats you kind of want to tell at the same time?
Well, the two kind of work together, like first you need to know what are the moments, the gameplay moments that actually feel good or make you feel something. But the narrative gives that moment context. It gives you a reason to feel something about it, and if it was just gameplay without any context, it wouldn't be as much fun, so narrative is serving the gameplay to give it meaning, to give it so that you have the right emotional response, and it's great if it all adds up to a story that feels like a story. But first it has to work as individual gameplay moments.
So for our listeners, can you kind of give your pitch for what Shinonuma is?
Sure. Shinonuma is set in a swamp on an island in the Japanese archipelago. There's it's funny because there's a lot of reuse in gaming, right? So this is not the first time we've seen this map. I think this map first appeared about 2 or 3 games ago, and then it's been remastered since then. And every time they do that, they change a couple things. This time we're using a lot of that original map, but with some additional stuff. And the story is part of the Vanguard Zombies storyline, which is pitting the players against a Nazi who has teamed up with a demon that can raise the dead. So that's where all the zombies are coming from.
Right.
And we got to stop him, or else, he's going to make an army of the dead that's going to, win World War II, basically.
Yeah.
And specifically in Shinonuma, one of the demons that we've teamed up with, because that's what gives us our additional powers, she has a lot of missing memories. And the main quest in that Shinonuma map is about restoring her memories, which is going to bring some plot twists and set up the next step in the Vanguard storyline.
So when you're thinking about doing the zombie story, how much of it, the plot, did you develop? How much are you told it needs to fit into this or that story?
Now that's another thing that's different from game to game. I have done maps where basically they had already figured out what the premise was and what all the gameplay was, and I needed to get a story in there that made sense of all the gameplay and made it all kind of come together. On Vanguard, that was something that we it came up a little bit out of the blue, because that game is actually, it belongs to a different studio, Sledgehammer, but the decision was made that they wanted to get a zombies mode in there as well. And so when that happened, I was kind of the person with the least to do on the game we were currently working on. So I feel like I creatively own most of the Vanguard zombie stuff, which has been a joy. I really enjoyed that. I got to name all these demons and come up with a lot of the situations. And then a lot of it, though, how we were talking about, you have to collaborate with your penciler. Yeah. It's like that as a game writer with the designers. They have a lot of gameplay ideas and stuff that I would never come up with. And so you meet in the middle. I'm like, okay, well, here's our characters, and here's kind of where I see this going. And then they come back and say, yeah, but we think it's going to be cool if you do this, this, and this. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to make that work. And and it might change some of my story ideas, but that's fine. We're going to wind up with something that neither of us expected, and hopefully is greater than the sum of its parts.
So, are you good at the video game? Have you played it yet?
I'm decent. It's funny because a lot of game writers are actually terrible gamers, or the funny thing too is that on a game like Call of Duty that has 3 or more modes to it, often you're working on a mode that it's not one that you choose to play.
Yeah.
So like I would play a lot of multiplayer just because you get in 10 minutes, you're done.
Right.
And zombies is more of a time commitment. So zombies was not my favorite mode coming into it, but I've grown to love it.
So when can our listeners find Shino Numa?
It went live 2 days ago, actually. So if you own the game, Call of Duty Vanguard, then that is a bit of content that would have been part of your update 2 days ago, and you should have that. And if you don't own the game, you should probably go get it. And one other aspect of all of this is, and I learned this in comics, is that the bigger the property you're working on, the more, diverse the reaction is going to be, and part of that is you're going to have a lot of pushback on things, like there are certain comics, if you're working on Superman or Batman, people are going to get pissed off because it's not their Superman or Batman that you chose to do, and that's fine. And I just remember those people actually love this thing. So it's not like I'm going to take it personally. Right. On something like Call of Duty, oh my God, there's a big community, there's a big zombies community, and they all have their version that they like, So we came out with Vanguard and we had changed up a few mechanics in there. It caught people off guard. Some of them just plain didn't like it. And when the game comes out, you've got about a year of post-launch content, and you course correct as you go. So this one was a big course correction for us, in terms of how the game plays out, and it seems to be well received, I hope. I'm seeing a lot of the people who weren't liking the previous stuff really liking this one.
So as the writer, how do you distance yourself from the feedback, or do you embrace it?
It depends. I don't keep up with all the Reddit groups and other things. There are people at the studio who do, and actually get a lot of useful information out of it. We were laughing about, sometimes you actually find out about bugs in the game that you don't know about because the community is talking about that stuff.
Yeah.
So, I try and keep a little, just to get a sense of the temperature out there and the general response, but I don't wallow in
it. probably for the best. It would, you can't be a wallower in the world of comic or anything, I guess. Mm-hmm. So you're also working on a new comic book called Star Riders for a company called Fenom Comics. Yeah. So did Fenom come to you, or was it Fenom? Fenom. Did Fenom come to you and say, we want you to write on a story? Did you go to them and say, I have a great story for you guys? How did this work?
Rob Hunter, who was an inker that I met at, I think I knew him before Crossgen, but we worked together at Crossgen. He's a great guy. He had met Tom Fenoglio, who is the publisher of Fenom, who was somebody that worked in a whole other industry and was very successful there, but always wanted to do comics and had ideas that he wanted to pursue. It was a lot like the situation at Crossgen with what's his name, Mark Alessi. Sorry, I had a little brain fart there, but okay. And so sometimes you find somebody that has the means to go ahead and get stuff made, and so that was the deal with Tom. He wanted to do this stuff. He had some ideas, and Rob recommended me to him. So we talked. I looked at several just sort of outlines, rather short pitches of story ideas that he had. And the one that really grabbed me was Star Riders, because it was kind of a space race story. That was something that I've always loved that kind of thing. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut, and so we just kind of collaborated a little bit. He was like, "Well, what could you do with this?" And then I gave him an outline of, okay, here's how I see this thing happening over X amount of issues. It's also self-contained. And one of the funny things, of course, is that when I started working in video games, they really want all of you, focused on the video game. You're on staff there, and that makes sense. But they allowed me to do a limited comics thing, and this thing was definitely a self-contained story. So we just developed it from there. We got Scott McDaniel lined up as the artist. I love Scott work. His Nightwing for me was like a character defining moment for that character. He's just amazingly dynamic in what he does great action. So it's been a joy working with Scott on this thing. And I think the whole COVID thing kind of messed with our timeline as far as when we wanted to roll this out, but now things are kind of getting back to normal, and this will see the light of day finally.
So what can you tell our listeners about Star Riders?
It's a sci-fi thing that I don't want to give away too much, of course, but it's also a family drama. There's a Russian scientist who comes over, who's kind of snatched up at the end of World War II and becomes part of the U.S. space program. But he understands, he comes up with a new form of mathematics that no one else can understand. He'll put it up there like a calculus equation, and everybody else is like, that's gibberish. He's like, no, that's how you beat the speed of light, and the only people who understand his transcalculus are his two sons. And it turns out that there's a mystery to why they're the only ones that get it, but it works. And so they actually developed the first faster than light travel. But when they use it, it's almost like they rang the dinner bell. It calls the attention of other forces out there in the universe. And what happens after that is actually just crazy. It's, I don't know that I want to tell any more than that, but it has universal implications.
That's pretty cool. It kind of reminds me of what I think it was Stephen Hawking's, who said maybe we shouldn't be reaching out into the universe. We may not like who answers.
Exactly. Yep.
So on Twitter, I saw, I think it was one of the posters or one of the tweets on Star Riders from the company of Fenom. There's a tagline on it. One of the taglines is "When you have no skin in the game." So how does that relate to the game, and how does that impact the characters when there's no skin in the game, or that connection?
That's kind of a play on words, and it's referring to what happens to the main characters. Gosh, here I am trying not to spoil too much, but they get changed very dramatically, and so the skin is more literal than it might sound. What happens to them makes them lose their humanity in one sense, and yet dealing with that, also brings out the humanity in them. So yeah, I think that was kind of a cute tagline that once you read the story has like double meaning.
So another thing I read on Twitter is something that you implied on your Twitter. You implied that this was your last comic work. Is that a real thing, or is that just something, this is your latest comic book work, or is this truly your last comic book work?
Well, when I went to work at Treyarch, basically I became exclusive to them, and they did allow me to carve out this one comics project early on, but really on an ongoing basis, I don't know if I'm going to get another chance to do something like that. Like working for them, it was okay to do an independent, self-contained, original thing, but I couldn't go and pick up a book at Marvel or DC and work on it, at night, because that would almost certainly get in the way of me being effective at the game stuff, which is fine by me. I love working on Call of Duty, and it's about as big a thing as you can get in the game space. So yeah, I'm quite happy with that. But that's really what it is. Unless there's another opportunity to carve out a thing, I've got my hands full.
So if Disney gives you a call and says, Negation War #3, can you work on it for us? You're going to be like, no, I am only doing video games.
You know what? I would ask. I would go to the folks, I would probably ask if that was okay. And they'd probably tell me, no, trust me, you got enough to do on Call of Duty.
So when can our listeners find Star Riders?
I don't know the release date yet. I think it's early next year, because Fenom actually has a whole slate of different projects. The first one there, that Ninja Hunter Bear book by Chuck Dixon and Mel Ruby, is going to be the first one that hits the stands. And I don't know the exact release date yet on the other stuff, but we'll get there.
So is this going to be Diamond distributed? Is this going to be a Comixology only? How does this work?
That I'm not sure about either. I mean, I would assume that it's going to be, if not Diamond distributed, physical copies in stores. Okay. With the option, of course, of getting the digital version. But yeah, I'm almost certain it's going to be in stores. I'm just not sure about the details on the distribution.
Well, I look forward to checking it out, Mr. Bedard. You're always one of my favorite writers. And
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. All right, take care, Jeff.